We are, as Canadians, involved in 4 times as many violations as the next 2 biggest offenders, which are India and Australia. And so when you look at wars that are happening around the world, whether you're talking about Somalia, whether you're talking about Eastern Congo, where a very brutal war has continued to be waged, which has been largely financed by the extractive industries, by resource extraction, particularly coltan, which is found in all of our cell phones, gold, tin, tungsten, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal revenues for militia groups every single year. And our national pension funds that are profiting from this kind of social dysfunction. You know, you don't have to go very far in our daily lives to see just how much we contribute to the horrific cycle that plagues countries around the world. It is literally in all of our cell phones, wars in all of our cell phones, it's in our pension funds, it's filling up our cars, it's on our ring fingers in the form of conflict diamonds. You know, Mugabe, the insipid Robert Mugabe, a couple of $100 million by March of this year on the sale of conflict diamonds. And we don't think about them. And it's astonishing, actually.
Does that not make you feel very impotent in what you're doing? You're going out to try and help in war zones that in the whole system that we live in is creating to a degree? I mean, they're not creating it, they're not instigating it, but they're fueling it. How do you remain non-cynical?
There are things that I get cynical about. It's not usually that, though. For me, I really believe in the potential for people to affect change. And that might sound very idealistic for many, but you just have to look around the world and there are shining examples of how that's possible. You know, whether it's Nelson Mandela in South Africa, whether it's the movements, the protest movements that are taking place in Egypt and throughout the Arab world, whether it's the important role that local organizations on the ground in many countries around the world are playing to advance gender equality, to make it possible for kids to live to see a better day. So I'm not so cynical about our capacity to do something. I actually genuinely believe that when people have the information and when they're given those opportunities, that in many cases we do embrace them. But part of the challenge is how you break through that noise. How do you give people that information? How do you motivate them to become interested in what's happening beyond our borders? To recognize that there are changes that we can all make that will benefit humanity. They can be very modest or they can be very significant. It's up to us to decide. But I think that knowledge, without being too cliched about it, knowledge is always power. And when you give people that knowledge, it's amazing to me what they will do with it.
When I was in Haiti, I saw a different form of militarization of aid. You know, the U.S. Army is digging ditches and the UN is handing off food off the back of their Humvees with rifles drawn. You talk a bit about this creeping militarization of aid that you've been seeing. Can you talk a bit about what you've seen since you started and the trend there?
Yeah, I mean, the real challenge with the militarization of aid is that aid has been subverted. I think actually, to be more accurate, it's been openly co-opted by military agendas. And it's been a gradual evolution, but it has been absolutely devastating to the humanitarian movement and also to civilians that rely on those aid operations. It began essentially with Somalia, where you had what was essentially a militarized humanitarian intervention under Operation Restore Hope, where you had troops that were coming in that were responsible for the safe delivery of humanitarian supplies and food distributions. And then it continued through with the former Yugoslavia and especially with Kosovo, where you had NATO troops that were setting up their own refugee camps and administering those refugee camps. And it was against it was despite the very significant protestations of most of the international aid organizations, especially Doctors Without Borders, MSF, who actively pointed out that if NATO is building refugee camps because they're on the NATO sites, that those refugees are going to be targeted, and indeed they all were. I mean, literally almost every single one of them, and thousands of people were killed as a result of that. And then it continued right through, but I think it really has reached its pinnacle with Iraq and Afghanistan. And Hearts and Minds initiatives, aid has actually been described in an American military handbook that came out a couple of years ago as a non-lethal weapons system. And they describe it as a non-lethal weapons system because essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to entice communities to cooperate by dangling aid incentives in front of them. And the reason why it's a problem is because it politicizes that which should never ever be political. Because to run an effective humanitarian operation, you have to have the support of local communities, you have to be seen as legitimate, you have to be well received, you have to have their trust and their confidence. And as soon as you brand that as part of the military agenda, as part of the external political agenda, then people become inherently mistrustful and cynical about those aid programs. And in addition to that, it's seen as just a complete extension of the military apparatus. So what happens in practical terms is that they get targeted more often. And we saw this in Afghanistan. The rates of attack on military-supported reconstruction initiatives and aid initiatives were significantly higher than what you would see on regular kind of aid operations. And as a result, what we're seeing right now is that attacks against aid workers are up worldwide by more than 177% in the last 10 years, where aid workers are being frequently killed and raped and coerced and harassed. We are also seeing more aid workers who are being killed in the line of duty than peacekeepers. And we're also putting our soldiers and civilians at risk, because when our soldiers are at these sites, they are usually less armed, they're right in the communities, they have less protection, and they're very, very vulnerable. And they've had hundreds of Swedish troops and Canadian troops and German troops who have been killed working on these military-administered aid programs. The Pentagon, since 2001, has controlled between 15% and 25% of the U.S. aid budget.
But has it ever been totally separated? I mean, in terms of, hasn't aid to a degree been part of imperialism, or whether or not it's the Canadian Army dropping the food in Afghanistan as it did at the beginning of the war, or it's sending its money to NGOs there? It's part of the same package, isn't it, a bit?
Well, it is, and I get into this in the book. I mean, you can't ever de-link the kind of ideology or the politics from any organization or any individual. I mean, if you're there and you're working, you come with your own cultural baggage and your own ideological baggage. There's no question of that. But if you look at the origins of the humanitarian movement, if you look at Henry Dumont and you look at the Red Cross and the origins of the Red Cross, the idea is to create, as much as possible, a neutral humanitarian space so that you're able to get access to communities who desperately need that support. And as soon as you start militarizing that, as soon as you start openly using it as a tool and as a weapon, then you've fostered that kind of hostility and resentment. And again, it gets back to, it just makes it that much harder overall to build good community relations. And then those aid programs become a target because they're seen as just another military activity in the country, and they're at war.
And yet, at the same time as this has been happening, aid has become bigger and bigger business too, which you go into in your book a little bit. How do you see aid in business now? Like, do you see, there's been a lot of criticism in the last few years as aid becoming more and more corporate, becoming more of a business as opposed to something that is like the Red Cross originated.
I do think, and I think that's a great tragedy. I mean, I think that there has been a tremendous amount of pressure on aid organizations to speak the language of business and to conform to corporate standards. And I think that there are some positive things that have come out of that in terms of accountabilities and reporting and monitoring and evaluating programs and demonstrating your added value. I think that there are some good lessons that come from that. But on the whole, I worry that we have drifted into a results-based ethos where what matters most is that you can show that you responded quickly to the largest number of people for the least amount of dollars, and not necessarily doing the due diligence around, was that intervention appropriate? Was it sustainable? Is it, who benefited from that? Because you can demonstrate great results if you're choosing people who already have a certain level of development or education, or the security situation will allow for it, but then you're neglecting an entire sector of any population that actually has longer odds. And that's the real challenge within that. And at the same time, I really do, and this is what I have seen, I think that the bigger is better dogma within the NGO community is actually partly what's stifling innovation, because it tends to reward a fairly elite group of very established, very large organizations who are prepared to embrace corporate funding, and who speak corporate language, and who will not be the voices of opposition or the voices of defiance when that's required of them. I mean, imagine if you're an NGO and you're receiving $1 million from an oil company that's operating in South Sudan. Are you going to bear witness to atrocities that oil company might be implicated in? You're not going to. And this is what I see as a very concerning trend. And it's made, I think, even more complicated by the way in which our aid dollars are now requiring a heavy amount of matched funding, which is big money, so that there are fewer numbers of grants that are for bigger and bigger amounts of money. So for you to even apply, for you to walk through the door, you better have $1 million in your back pocket, or you're not eligible. And it really is killing the small to medium-sized organizations in this country, who are often the ones that have the very strong grassroots connections, and who are in many cases doing, I personally believe, the most kind of groundbreaking and innovative work that you'll see at the field level.
Interesting. So what I saw in Haiti was, first of all, a gong show in terms of the number of NGOs, like just incredible, but also branding on tents, and you mentioned this, this is a Save the Children spot, this is a plan spot, and very little coordination. You talk a little bit about this, but as an outsider coming into Haiti, I was like, why are these NGOs not working together? Can you talk a bit about what you've seen in these countries, and how rare it is for people to work together, and why that is?
Well, some of that is ideological, but the real thing about NGO coordination is that there's no incentive. The vast majority of the really large organizations in Canada and the United States that have the biggest budgets, so the deepest pockets, are the ones who are either primarily or significantly engaged in emergency relief. And so that means that they can, when any crisis hits, they can say that they can run their ads, and they're on the ground, and they're doing the work, and please give to us. And they try to distinguish themselves from others. And so what that ends up doing, I mean, most of the money is given within the first 3 weeks. So there's a huge amount of pressure on those groups to be on the ground and to be highly visible and to own the story. And I think the media actually have a responsibility in this as well, because the reason why you will see the hyper branding and everybody in their matching t-shirts and everybody jockeying for position is because that's what drives donations. And so there isn't any incentive to cooperate, because cooperation will mean that you'll be left behind. And especially if you're on the ground and you're not visible, then you're just not going to drive those donations. And people, it's also about changing our expectations here, because we expect to see that. If you write a check to an organization, you expect them to come back and say, here we are, we're on the ground, look at us, you can see exactly how your dollars are at work. I mean, they may not be specifically your dollars, but there's somebody's dollars that are there that are at work, right? And that drives that cycle. And so it's hard in many ways to blame the NGOs for that, because if you don't do that, you will pass up millions and millions of dollars, which will ultimately impact on your programming, which will ultimately cost people, potentially, their lives. So, you know, sometimes it comes from a good place, but the execution of it is deeply flawed. And in recent years, there's been a humanitarian coalition. So they've had a couple of different organizations, MSF, Oxfam, Save the Children, Plan, ones that are involved in emergency relief have come together as one unit to say, give to the coalition. But even the coalition model is also flawed, because if you're part of the coalition, the amount of money that you then claim is based on your budget and your size. So if you're a small organization going into a coalition initiative, you'll lose out in that equation, because you'll get a very small piece of that pie, and it might make more sense for you to be on the ground competing with everybody else. It's flawed.
Doesn't that contradict with what you were saying, though, in terms of aid workers being more vulnerable now and more targeted? Are you talking about this happening only in catastrophes, natural catastrophes, as opposed to war zones?
Yeah, there's an important distinction. Yeah, we're talking about natural catastrophes as opposed to war zones. But you know, the interesting thing about war zones is that many organizations are still operating on that same principle, and it's partly why they're being targeted. You know, you still have organizations that drape themselves in, you know, their NGO flags and their NGO T-shirts and their clearly branded NGO cars, believing, holding on to those ideals that signifies that you are an impartial, apolitical entity. And in reality, in many of the most dangerous corners of the world, if you are clearly identified as an international aid organization, you're putting yourself at huge risk.
Right. You say in your book you snuck into Iraq posing as a journalist, that it was safer to be a journalist than it was to be an aid worker there.
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't get across the border. We were in Jordan, and we tried to get across the border, and they wouldn't let us. They said, no aid organizations. This was the Jordanians had taken over the Iraqi outposts, and right after the fall of Saddam's statue. So they said, no, you can't come in because you're not journalists. So we came back. We put TV all over our car and duct tape, the letters TV, and then came back, and we waited for the changing of the guards, and we came back with our Ontario driver's licenses. And so we handed our driver's license to this guard, and he said, you have to be a journalist. And my husband and I said, no, the flower means we're journalists. So they looked at our trilliums and the guy went, okay.
That's pretty funny. So in your book you talk about, there's this idea that, you talk also about tourism, voluntourism, and the cottage industry of aid and how that's rising, and something that Christoph writes about a lot in the New York Times. But you say there's an idea out there that every little extra bit helps. It doesn't. Can you unpack that a bit?
Well, I talk about, in fact, I have a whole chapter called Paved with Good Intentions. And those of you who know, the first part of that sentence is the road to hell, right? And I've seen this around the world. We believe that having good intentions will mean that we will have a good outcome. And that's not always the case. And I get into issues around voluntourism where it might make us feel really good to get on a plane and to nail boards into a school in a less fortunate part of the world, or to spend time, a couple of days, caring for some orphaned children in Cambodia, for example. That might make us feel really good, and we might even write a check attached to that experience. But it has become a for-profit venture, and there are a number of groups around the world who will charge people who have very good intentions $5,000 to $12,000 a pop to go to some other part of the world and to engage in this kind of make-work philanthropy. And what rarely gets asked in that equation is, what is the impact, and is that the best way to use that money and that experience? And so, for example, you can go and do that, but did you consider that you might actually be putting some local carpenters and tradespeople out of jobs? Did you consider that there might be, if it's a young group of school children that are going, like 17-year-old and 18-year-old school group classroom, that maybe there are 17-year-old and 18-year-old children living within those communities who are desperate for those kinds of opportunities and who would like nothing more than to be involved in rebuilding their school in their communities? Did you consider that in the case of orphans, that we often, and you'll see people come back and they'll, they're very well intended, and they'll have pictures of themselves with hyper affectionate toddlers and preschoolers, but it's actually normal for children to be afraid of strangers at that age. And often, and there are a huge number of psychological studies that have looked at this issue, the reason why kids in those situations become so hyper-friendly and provide us with a really good experience is because they're so used to forming repeated short-term attachments, which are actually symbolic of the extreme level of their trauma. So when we come back saying, oh, well, the kids were so friendly and so happy to see us, I mean, imagine, for those of you who are parents in this room, imagine if your 4-year-old and 5-year-old every 2 weeks got to know somebody and got to love somebody and enjoyed their company, and then they were gone, and then there was somebody else, and then they were gone, and there was somebody else, and this continued on for most of their childhood. And it's irresponsible. In the same way that our good intentions, we'll see people, and I've been on the receiving end of some very interesting phone calls over the years, but people will, pack up their used T-shirts and their flip-flops or their surplus. In one case, it was surplus left-footed shoes only. Honestly, he calls me. He's like, he's got 5,000 left-footed shoes and wanted to know if we wanted to send them to Africa. And it's all in those situations where I find myself going, is this really happening? But the the loss of hundreds of thousands of textile jobs in Africa have been directly linked to the trade of surplus used goods from our corner of the world. And we don't think these things through. Good development requires on-the-ground knowledge, it requires experience, it requires strong local connections, it requires investments, consistent investments in local communities, in training them so that they are able to be the architects of their own change. And every time we try to export that, and every time we try to impose that, we undermine that local resiliency, and we often create more problems. And it's not that I fault people for doing these things, because it often comes from a very, very good place. But it's important, before you make those steps, to really understand the measure of your impact and to ask the hard questions of yourselves. And sometimes the better thing to do is, if you want to go to Africa or you want to go to Latin America, do it. Go be a tourist. Spend your tourist dollars in local economies. Talk to people. Spend it on local women's cooperatives and buying their goods and bringing them home and giving them to your friends for the holidays. Those are wonderful, wonderful things that you're doing, but you don't need to occupy yourself with this busy work philanthropy, because you may be doing more harm than good.
You're here, I totally agree. Anyway, I have a lot more questions and I could interview for a long time, but you guys are selfish and you want to ask questions, so I have to turn it over to you.